"Don't move," he whispered, his breath hot and heavy against the shell of my ear, sending a violent shiver down my spine. "If you take one more step toward that door, little moon, I'm going to forget that I promised to be gentle." My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I knew better than to wake the king before dawn. I knew better than to try and slip out of the alpha's bed while his scent still clung to my skin like a brand. But I did it anyway. And now, as his massive hand shackled my waist, pulling me back into the darkness of the sheets, I realized that my reckless little rebellion was about to have consequences that would keep me breathless for the rest of the morning. Who else just got shivers? Welcome back, my lovely listeners, to Storm's Werewolf Romance Library. We are diving deep into a brand new original story today, a world of obsession, misunderstandings, and sweet, sweet romance. But before we find out exactly what the Alpha King does next, please take a quick second to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. If you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Join our pack! And for my superfans who want even more, check out the channel membership for exclusive perks. I want to hear from you today. Drop a comment right now letting me know where in the world you're listening from, and as we go through the story, don't be shy. Tell me your favorite moments in the comments. I read every single one. Now, grab a cozy blanket and get comfortable, because things are about to get steamy. Chapter 1. The Monster in My Bed. If the Silver Mist Pack could see their Luna right now, the rumors would probably spiral out of control before breakfast was even served. They whisper about this room in the corridors, their voices dropping to hushed, fearful tones whenever they pass the heavy oak doors of the royal suite. They imagine a dungeon draped in velvet, a place where the terrifying Alpha King keeps his fragile mate locked away from the light of day. They look at me with pity in the council hall, searching my neck for bruises, searching my eyes for the haunted look of a woman who sleeps beside a monster. They are completely wrong, of course, but not entirely off the mark regarding my current imprisonment. I am indeed trapped, pinned to the mattress, not by iron chains or ancient spells, but by the 250-pound wall of muscle currently using me as his personal body pillow. Bastian was not a light sleeper, nor was he a polite one. In the waking world, King Bastian was a figure of lethal grace and terrifying silence. A man who could silence a room full of rowdy warriors with a single arch of his dark brow. But in the sanctuary of our bed, the Alpha King was a clingy, overheating furnace who refused to let me move more than an inch from his chest. I stared up at the canopy of our bed, counting the embroidered silver leaves on the dark fabric, trying to ignore the parched feeling in my throat. We had stayed up far too late last night, whispering in the dark about everything and absolutely nothing. And now the consequences of that dehydration were setting in. I needed water. I needed it desperately. But getting to the crystal pitcher on the bedside table required navigating the obstacle course that was my husband. Carefully, moving with the stealth of a thief, I tried to slide my hips to the left. I held my breath, praying to the moon goddess that he remained in the deep, comatose slumber that usually claimed him after a long week of border patrols. For a moment, success seemed within reach. I managed to wiggle a few inches toward the edge of the mattress, creating a sliver of glorious, cool space between our bodies. Freedom was so close, I could almost taste the cool water waiting for me. Then, a low rumble vibrated through the mattress, a sound so deep it felt less like a noise and more like a small earthquake. Before I could even process the warning, the massive arm around my waist tightened like a steel band. With a singular, effortless motion, Bastian hauled me backward, sliding me across the silk sheets until my back was pressed flush against his chest once more. He didn't even wake up. He simply rearranged me like a wayward plush toy that had fallen off the shelf, burying his face into the curve of my neck with a contented, heavy sigh that tickled my skin. I let out a huff of defeated laughter, staring at the water pitcher that was now further away than when I started. This was the tyrant the kingdom feared. This man who mumbled unintelligibly into my hair and threw his heavy leg over my thighs to pin me down completely. The pack believed I walked on eggshells around him, terrified of his temper. The reality was that my biggest struggle was convincing him that I needed to function as a human being and not just a permanent fixture in his bed. "Bastian," I whispered, poking the arm that was currently crushing my ribs. "Bastian, you have to let go. I need a drink." He didn't budge. If anything, he grew heavier, his breathing evening out into a slow, rhythmic pattern against my ear. It was infuriatingly endearing. I loved him, I truly did, but I also loved hydration. I decided to try a different tactic, reaching back to scratch lightly at the base of his scalp, right where his hairline met the back of his neck. I knew his weak spots better than his generals knew the terrain of our borders. The reaction was instantaneous. The crushing grip on my waist loosened just a fraction as a soft, almost purring sound rumbled in his chest. Seizing the opportunity, I tried to roll away again, inching toward the edge of the bed. I made it to the side, swinging one leg out into the cool morning air. I placed my foot on the rug, ready to stand, ready to claim my victory over the sleeping beast. Suddenly, a hand wrapped around my ankle. It wasn't rough, but it was firm, halting my escape instantly. The room went silent, the playful atmosphere shifting into something thicker, something charged with a sudden intense awareness. "Don't move," a voice rasped, rough with sleep and dark with promise. I froze, looking back over my shoulder. Bastian was awake. His eyes were open, the irises a swirling storm of molten silver that glowed in the dim light of the room. He wasn't looking at me like a sleepy husband anymore. He was looking at me like I was the only meal he would ever need. He tugged on my ankle, dragging me slowly back up the length of the bed until I was hovering over him, trapped by his gaze. "If you take one more step toward that door, little moon," he whispered, his hand sliding up my calf to rest possessively on my thigh. "I'm going to forget that I promised to be gentle. And the sun won't be the only thing rising this morning." Chapter 2. Whispers in the Council Hall. The great wooden doors of the council hall groaned open, announcing our arrival with a sound that echoed like thunder against the high stone ceilings. The air inside was cool and still, carrying the faint, dusty smell of old parchment and beeswax candles. As I walked beside Bastian, his hand resting possessively on the small of my back, I could physically feel the atmosphere in the room shift. The chatter of the pack elders died instantly, replaced by the scraping of chairs as 20 of the most powerful wolves in the Silver Mist territory scrambled to their feet, bowing low in reverence, and, if I wasn't mistaken, genuine fear. I kept my chin high, mimicking the regal posture Bastian had taught me, though inside I was fighting the urge to roll my eyes. If only they knew how their terrifying king had spent the last hour. They saw a warlord in black leather and fur, his expression carved from granite. I saw the man who had pouted for 10 minutes straight because I wouldn't let him braid my hair before we left, claiming he needed to practice his technique. We took our seats at the head of the massive U-shaped table. Bastian sat on his throne-like chair, looking every bit the lethal monarch. I sat in the slightly smaller, cushioned chair to his right. Almost immediately, the whispers started. They were faint, meant to be unheard by human ears. But my hearing had sharpened since joining the pack, and Bastian's presence seemed to amplify everything around us. "Look at her hands," one elder murmured to another, glancing at where my fingers gripped the edge of the table. "She's trembling. Poor thing is terrified of him." "He probably scolded her for the delay," another whispered back, shaking his head with pity. "He has no patience for weakness." I bit the inside of my cheek to keep my expression neutral. I wasn't trembling from fear. My hands were shaking slightly because my muscles were fatigued from the impromptu wrestling match Bastian and I had engaged in just before leaving our chambers. A match involving a lot of tickling and very little actual combat. But I couldn't exactly announce that to the council. As the meeting droned on, covering topics from grain shipments to border patrols, Bastian remained stoic. He barely spoke, offering only curt nods or low grunts of approval. To the room, he was a brooding storm cloud waiting to strike. But then, I felt it. His large, rough hand slid quietly beneath the heavy tablecloth, finding my knee. I stiffened slightly, keeping my eyes fixed on the elder presenting a map of the northern river. Bastian's fingers began to trace idle patterns on my skin, drawing slow, deliberate circles through the fabric of my dress. It was a comforting, grounding touch, the kind he always offered when he knew I was bored. But then, the circles changed. He began tracing letters. I frowned slightly, focusing on the sensation. L-O-V. I risked a glance at him. Bastian was staring straight ahead, his face a mask of terrifying indifference as he listened to a report about timber yields. Under the table, his thumb finished the E and started drawing a lopsided heart. A bubble of laughter rose in my throat, panic flaring in my chest as I tried to suppress it. He was doing this on purpose. He knew exactly how ticklish I was, and he knew I couldn't react. The elder droning on about lumber paused, looking at me with concern. "My queen, are you unwell? You look flushed." Bastian's hand squeezed my thigh gently, a silent warning and a caress all at once. I cleared my throat, forcing a cough to cover the giggle that was threatening to escape. "I am fine, Elder. Merely overwhelmed by the details." "Overwhelmed," Bastian repeated, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that made the entire table freeze. He turned to look at me, his eyes dark and unreadable to them, but shining with mischief to me. "Perhaps the air in here is too stifling for my mate." "No, really, I started, but Bastian's hand moved higher, his thumb brushing a sensitive spot on my inner thigh that made me jump in my seat. The movement was small, but in the stillness of the room, it was noticeable. The elders exchanged horrified looks, convinced I had flinched away from his anger. Bastian stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the stone floor. The sound was like a gunshot. "The meeting is adjourned," he declared, his voice leaving no room for argument. "My Luna is distressed. We are leaving." Before I could protest or explain that I was actually having a great time, he had swept me up, his arm clamping around my waist like a steel band, steering me toward the exit. He marched us out of the hall with a speed that bordered on frantic, leaving a room full of stunned, pitying wolves in his wake. "You are terrible," I whispered as soon as the doors slammed shut behind us, the heavy wood muffling the sound of the council. Bastian didn't slow down. He pulled me closer into his side, his stoic mask shattering into a devilish grin. "I was bored," he murmured against my hair, walking us briskly toward the royal wing. And besides, I didn't like the way the treasurer was looking at you. He is 80 years old, Bastian. He is male, Bastian countered, his voice dropping an octave, losing its humour and gaining a sudden intense heat. And right now, you smell like ink and old men. We need to fix that immediately. Chapter 3. The Scent of Possession. Bastian didn't just walk us back to our chambers, he practically marched us there, his stride long and purposeful, forcing me to half-jog to keep up with him. His arm never left my waist, holding me so tight against his side that I could feel the hard thump of his heart against my ribs. It wasn't racing with anger, but with a steady, driving rhythm that I had come to recognize as his specific brand of focused determination. "You're being ridiculous," I said, breathless as we rounded the corner to the royal wing. The guards stationed outside our door snapped to attention, but Bastian ignored them completely, pushing the heavy double doors open and kicking them shut behind us with a definitive thud. "I am not being ridiculous," Bastian growled, finally releasing me, but only to spin me around and bury his face in the crook of my neck. He inhaled deeply, a long, shuddering breath that seemed to pull the very air from my lungs. "You smell like dust, and beeswax, and that treasurer's cheap cologne." I laughed, bringing my hands up to cup his face, trying to push him back gently. "I sat next to him for an hour, Bastian. Scents linger. It's not a crime." "It should be," he muttered against my skin, his nose grazing along my jawline, replacing the offending scents with the warmth of his breath. "I don't like it. I don't like smelling anyone else on you. It makes my wolf pace." This was the great secret of the Alpha King. The world thought he was a territorial monster who viewed me as property. The truth was far softer and infinitely more complicated. Bastian found comfort in our shared scent. To him, smelling me was like taking a sedative. It quieted the constant noise of the pack bond in his head. When my scent was obscured by the outside world, he got anxious, fidgety, and prone to dramatic declarations. He pulled back, his silver eyes searching mine, filled with a vulnerability that would have brought the council to its knees in shock. "Wash it off?" he asked, his voice rough and hopeful. "Please." I softened instantly. How could I say no to him when he looked at me like that? "Okay," I whispered, running my thumb over his cheekbone. "But you're helping. You're the one who dragged me out of there." A slow smile spread across his face, the predatory edge returning. "It would be my honour, my queen." 10 minutes later, the massive bathroom was filled with steam, turning the space into a misty private world. The sound of the rain shower thrumming against the tile was a constant soothing rhythm. I stood under the spray, the hot water cascading over my shoulders, while Bastian worked a bar of handmade soap into a rich lather between his large hands. The scent of sandalwood and fresh rain filled the air. His scent. He stepped into the spray behind me, his chest pressing against my back. He moved with agonizing slowness, his soapy hand sliding over my shoulders, down my arms, scrubbing away the invisible remnants of the council meeting. It wasn't sexual, not exactly. It was reverent. He washed me with the same focus he applied to sharpening his blades or reviewing treaties. Every inch of skin had to be reclaimed. "Better," he murmured, his lips pressing a kiss to the wet skin of my shoulder. "Much better." I leaned back against him, closing my eyes, letting the heat of the water and his body seep into my bones. You know the pack thinks you're controlling, right? Dragging me out of meetings, washing me yourself. Let them think what they want, Bastian rumbled, his hands moving to my waist, his thumbs tracing the curve of my hips. They don't know that the only thing I'm controlling is my own sanity. If I couldn't smell you right now, Nora, I think I'd be climbing the walls. He turned me around to face him, the water plastering his dark hair to his forehead. He looked wild and beautiful in the steam, droplets catching in his eyelashes. He took the soap again, sliding it over my collarbone, his eyes tracking the movement with obsessive intensity. You are mine, he whispered, the words sounding less like a command and more like a prayer he was offering to the universe. Every part of you, the air you breathe, the space you occupy. I need all of it. He rinsed the suds from my skin, the water running clear, leaving nothing but the scent of him clinging to me. He backed me slowly against the cool tiles of the shower wall, caging me in with his arms, his wet body pressing full length against mine. The playfulness from the hallway was gone, replaced by a heavy, searing intensity that made my knees weak. Promise me something, he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, his forehead resting against mine. Anything, I breathed, and I meant it. Don't ever let anyone else get this close, he said, his eyes burning into mine. If you ever come home smelling like another alpha, I might just burn this entire kingdom down to find the source. Chapter 4. The Alpha's Appetite. By the time we emerged from the bathroom, wrapped in plush, oversized robes that swallowed my frame and barely covered Bastian's broad chest, the sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting long, golden shadows across the floor of our bedroom. The steam from the shower had followed us out, making the air in the room feel heavy and languid. A knock at the door broke the silence. Your Majesty, the midday meal you requested. Leave it, Bastian commanded through the door, his voice leaving no room for discussion. We waited until the sound of the service cart rattling away faded down the corridor, before Bastian opened the door, wheeled the cart in himself, and locked the world out once again. The spread was ridiculous. There were platters of roasted venison, bowls of steaming root vegetables, fresh bread still warm from the ovens, and a mountain of seasonal fruits. It was enough food to feed a small squad of warriors, yet Bastian had ordered it all for just the two of us. He bypassed the small dining table near the window entirely, pushing the cart straight to the foot of the bed. We're eating here, he announced, sitting on the edge of the mattress and patting the space between his legs. Come here. I climbed onto the bed, settling myself between his outstretched legs, leaning back against his chest. It was our favorite way to eat, messy, informal, and completely against royal protocol. The pack staff would have fainted if they saw their queen eating roast duck with her fingers, while the king used my shoulder as a napkin. Bastian reached for the platter, tearing off a piece of the venison. He didn't eat it himself. Instead, he brought it to my lips, his eyes watching me expectantly. Eat, he murmured. You barely touched your breakfast. I took the bite, chewing slowly. The meat was tender, rich with herbs and savory juices. I hummed in appreciation, and I felt Bastian's chest rumble against my back in response. He loved feeding me. It was another one of his primal, nurturing quirks. He would pick through the food, selecting the best morsels, the sweetest berries, the crispest crusts, and offer them to me like tributes. The treasurer was right about the timber, you know, I said after swallowing, reaching for a grape. The northern yield is down. Bastian groaned, resting his chin on top of my head. Please, little moon, no politics in the bed. I spent 2 hours listening to them drone on. I need to cleanse my brain. And how do you propose to do that? I teased, turning my head slightly to look at him. By watching you eat, he said simply, picking up a large red strawberry from the bowl. It's infinitely more interesting than timber yields. He held the berry up, twirling it by its green stem. It was perfectly ripe, the red flesh glistening in the afternoon light. He brought it to my mouth, but instead of letting me take it, he teased my bottom lip with the cool fruit, painting the juice against my skin. Open, he commanded softly. I parted my lips, and he pushed the berry in, his thumb brushing against my teeth. It was sweet, bursting with flavour, but as I bit down, my teeth grazed the pad of his thumb. It was an accident, a slip of coordination, but the effect was instantaneous. Bastian froze. His hand didn't pull away. Instead, he kept his thumb there, resting against my lower lip, catching a drop of red juice that escaped. The atmosphere in the room shifted from cozy domesticity to something sharp and electric. I watched his pupils dilate, swallowing the silver of his irises until his eyes were almost black. He slowly withdrew his thumb, bringing it to his own mouth to lick the juice and the memory of my bite off his skin. His gaze never left mine, heavy and dark with a hunger that had nothing to do with the roast venison on the cart. You have no idea, he whispered, his voice sounding like gravel grinding together, how dangerous it is to taste you. It was an accident, I breathed, my heart starting that familiar frantic hammering against my ribs. Was it? Bastian challenged. He leaned forward, closing the distance between us, his hand moving to grip the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my damp hair. Because looking at you right now, with that juice on your lip, I think I'm still hungry. And I don't think fruit is going to cut it. Chapter 5. The Garden Escape 9. The aftermath of our bedside banquet left me feeling wonderfully lethargic, heavy with rich food and the lingering heat of Bastian's gaze. He had eventually fallen into a deep, satisfied sleep, his arm draped over my waist like a seatbelt, his breathing slow and rhythmic. As much as I loved the cocoon of our room, the air had grown stifling, thick with the scent of roasted meat and heated skin. I needed to breathe. I needed the crisp bite of the winter air to clear the fog from my head. Extricating myself from Bastian's grip was a military operation in itself. I moved by millimeters, replacing my body with a heavy down pillow, which he immediately pulled against his chest with a grunt. Satisfied that the beast would slumber on, I grabbed my thickest wool cloak, slipped into my boots, and crept out to the private balcony that connected to the castle's sprawling winter garden. The garden was a world of white and gray, silent under a blanket of fresh snow. The stone paths were icy, and the dormant rose bushes looked like skeletal fingers reaching for the pale sky. It was beautiful in a stark, lonely way. I walked aimlessly, enjoying the crunch of snow beneath my boots, and the way the cold air stung my cheeks, flushing them with color. It was the first time I had been truly alone in days, and the solitude was refreshing. But solitude, when you are mated to the alpha king, is an illusion. The hair on the back of my neck stood up long before I heard the sound. It was a primal instinct, a sudden awareness of being watched by an apex predator. I stopped near the frozen fountain, my heart skipping a beat, and turned slowly. Emerging from the shadow of the ancient oak trees was a wolf. But to call him a wolf felt like an insult to his sheer magnitude. He was massive, his shoulder height easily clearing my waist, a creature of myth and muscle. His fur was a shimmering metallic silver, that blended perfectly with the snow, and his eyes were the same molten mercury as my husband's. The pack would have been terrified. A beast of that size, stalking through the garden with silent, lethal grace, was the stuff of nightmares. But as he prowled closer, his massive paws making no sound on the snow, I didn't feel fear. I felt a bubble of laughter rise in my chest. "You are terrible at stealth," I called out, my voice misting in the cold air. The giant wolf huffed, a distinctly human sound of annoyance coming from a canine throat, and abandoned his stalking crouch. He trotted toward me, his tail giving a single heavy wag that stirred the snow behind him. When he reached me, he didn't growl or snap. He nudged his massive wet nose against my palm, demanding affection with the subtlety of a freight train. I buried my hands in the thick ruff of fur around his neck, scratching the spot behind his ears that I knew he loved. "Did you wake up and panic because the pillow didn't smell like me?" He let out a low rumble that vibrated through my chest, leaning his entire weight against my legs, nearly knocking me over. It was a game we played often, the mighty king pretending to be a pet, shedding the weight of the crown to just be an animal enjoying the touch of his mate. I pushed back against his shoulder, and he playfully snapped his jaws at the air near my hand, his eyes dancing with mischief. "Catch me if you can, Your Majesty," I teased, turning and sprinting across the snowy lawn. I didn't get far. I heard the heavy thud of paws behind me, the sound of a predator closing the distance in seconds. I shrieked, half laughing, as I tried to pivot around a stone bench, but my boot caught a patch of ice. The world tilted. I braced myself for the hard impact of the frozen ground, but it never came. Instead, a wall of heat slammed into me. I was tackled into a snowbank, but I didn't land on the cold powder. I landed on warm, bare skin. I gasped, blinking snow from my lashes. Bastian hovered over me, his human form restored. He was stark naked, completely unbothered by the freezing temperature, his skin radiating a furnace-like heat that melted the snow beneath us. His hair was wild, his chest heaving with exertion, and a wicked, triumphant grin curved his lips. "Caught you," he rasped, his voice deep and rough from the shift. He pinned my wrists gently above my head, his body shielding me from the cold, his eyes blazing with a wild, possessive light. "And now, little moon, I believe the penalty for trying to outrun your alpha is quite severe." Chapter 6. Thunder and Velvet. The playful mood of the afternoon vanished as quickly as the winter sun. By evening the sky had turned a bruised, angry purple, and the wind began to howl around the stone towers of the citadel like a wounded animal. A winter storm was rolling in, heavy and violent. For most wolves, a storm was just weather. For an alpha of Bastian's power, it was a challenge, a disturbance in the atmosphere that set his instincts on edge. We were back in our chambers, but the room looked different. Bastian had spent the last hour engaging in behaviour that the pack would have found baffling, but which I found utterly endearing. He was nesting. He had stripped the bed of its usual neat arrangement, pulling every duvet, fur throw and silk pillow into the centre of the mattress. He had even raided the guest closet down the hall, returning with armfuls of extra blankets to add to the pile. He built a literal fortress of softness, a cave made of velvet and down, designed to keep the world out and keep me in. "Bastian," I said softly, watching him critically adjust a pillow for the third time. "I think we have enough blankets to survive an ice age." He paused, looking at his creation with a furrowed brow, then looked at me. He looked restless, his movements jerky and agitated. "The atmospheric pressure is dropping. The wind is too loud, It drowns out the perimeter senses. He grabbed my hand, pulling me toward the bed. Get in the center, where it's deepest. I didn't argue. I climbed into the massive nest he had constructed, sinking into the layers of fur until I was practically buried. It was ridiculously comfortable, warm and soft, and smelling entirely of him. Bastian followed me instantly, crawling in and curling his massive frame around my back, pulling the edges of the blankets up over our heads until we were encased in a dark, warm cocoon. Better? I whispered in the darkness, feeling his chest vibrating against my spine. Quiet, he grumbled, burying his face in my hair, inhaling deeply. The storm is loud. You are quiet. I need you to focus. We lay there for a long time, the only light filtering in from the small gaps in the blanket fort. Outside, the wind screamed against the glass, rattling the window panes in their frames. Every time the wind gusted, Bastian's arms tightened around me, his body acting as a physical shield against a threat that couldn't actually reach us. You know the storm can't hurt us inside the castle, right? I asked, tracing the veins on his forearm with my fingertips. The walls are 5 feet thick. Logic doesn't work on the wolf right now, he admitted, his voice a low rumble in the small space. The wolf says the sky is screaming, so I must hold you until it stops. If I let go, the sky might take you. My heart squeezed. This powerful, terrifying king, who commanded armies and executed traitors, was reduced to a protective heap of nerves because of some thunder. It wasn't about fear for himself. It was an overwhelming, irrational fear for me. I'm not going anywhere, I promised, turning in his arms so I could face him in the dim light. I couldn't see his features clearly, just the glint of his eyes and the outline of his jaw. I'm right here in your fortress. Good, he breathed, pressing his forehead against mine. Stay. Just then, a crack of thunder shattered the sky directly above the castle. It was deafening, a sound like the earth itself cracking open. The room shook. I gasped, an involuntary flinch that I couldn't suppress. Bastian moved faster than thought. He surged over me, covering my entire body with his own, pressing me deep into the mattress. A low, menacing growl ripped from his throat, not directed at me, but directed at the ceiling, at the storm itself. It was a feral, dangerous sound, a warning to the heavens. Shh, he soothed, his hand cradling the back of my head, shielding my ears. I've got you. I've got you. Bastian, it's just thunder, I whispered, my heart racing more from his reaction than the noise. I don't care what it is, he snarled softly, his lips brushing against my temple, his body tense as a coiled spring. If the sky thinks it can scare you in my own home, then the sky is my enemy, and I will tear the clouds apart with my bare hands if that's what it takes to keep you calm. Chapter 7. The Training Ground Spectacle. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the world scoured clean and bright. The air was crisp, and the sky was a piercing, innocent blue that belied the violence of the previous night. I felt restless after being cooped up in Bastian's fortress for 12 hours, so I decided to visit the training grounds. I loved watching the warriors train. There was a rhythm to it, the clash of wooden swords, the grunts of exertion, the disciplined movement of bodies in sync. I wrapped myself in a heavy silver cloak and walked down the stone steps to the lower courtyard. The moment my boot hit the gravel, the rhythm broke. A young wolf near the edge of the field spotted me and elbowed his partner. The movement rippled through the ranks like a wave. Within seconds, 50 shirtless, sweating warriors had stopped their drills, standing at rigid attention, eyes wide. They looked terrified. And then I saw why. Bastian was in the centre of the ring. He usually oversaw training from the balcony, but today he was down in the mud with them. He held a dulled training blade in one hand, his chest heaving, sweat glistening on his skin. When he saw me, his expression shifted from focused commander to something entirely more ridiculous. He straightened up, rolled his shoulders, and suddenly the intensity dialed up to 11. He turned to the nearest training dummy, a heavy wooden post wrapped in leather, and unleashed a strike so powerful it didn't just dent the wood, it shattered the post in half, sending splinters flying across the yard. He paused, striking a pose that highlighted his biceps, and glanced at me to see if I was watching. I bit my lip to keep from laughing. He was showing off. The king of the Silver Mist Pack, the Nightbringer, the alpha of alphas, was acting like a teenager trying to impress his crush at gym class. "Continue!" he barked at the men, who scrambled to resume their sparring, though they looked terrified of being near him in this mood. Bastian strode toward me, discarding the broken sword. He stopped at the edge of the field, wiping sweat from his brow with his forearm. "You should be inside," he said, though his eyes were eating up the sight of me. "It's cold." "I wanted to watch," I said, leaning against the wooden railing. "You have excellent form, Your Majesty." He preened. There was no other word for it. He practically vibrated with pride. "The form is adequate. The power is what matters." He looked around the dusty, gravel-filled sideline where I was standing and frowned deeply. "Why are you standing? You'll get tired." Before I could assure him that my legs worked perfectly fine, he bellowed across the field, "Stop!" The entire regiment froze mid-swing. Silence descended instantly. "Bring a chair!" Bastian roared. "And cushions! The Luna is standing on gravel!" 3 massive warriors tripped over themselves to run to the armory, returning seconds later with a heavy wooden chair and several velvet pillows that looked like they had been stolen from the council room. They set it up reverently. Bastian inspected it, brushed an invisible speck of dust from the cushion, and then gestured for me to sit. "Comfortable?" he asked intensely, kneeling in the dirt in front of me, ignoring the 50 soldiers watching their king kneel before his mate. "Very," I said, face burning with amusement. "You can go back to breaking things now." He smirked, kissed my gloved hand, and stood up. He turned back to the field, ready to resume his display of dominance for my entertainment. Just then, a young recruit, rushing to get back into formation, stumbled. He didn't fall, but he careened sideways, bumping hard into the back of my chair. It jarred me, barely a shake, but the heavy wood scraped loudly against the stone. The sound was like a thunderclap in the silence. The recruit froze, his face draining of all blood. The other warriors took a collective step back. I opened my mouth to say I was fine, that it was nothing, but Bastian had already turned. He didn't yell. He didn't roar. He simply pivoted slowly on his heel, his face completely devoid of emotion, his eyes glowing with that terrible molten silver light. The air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees. He looked at the trembling boy, then at the chair, then at me. "You jostled her," Bastian said. His voice was quiet. Too quiet. It carried across the field like the whisper of a blade being drawn from a sheath. "My mate is sitting, and you moved her." Chapter 8. The Bruise That Wasn't. The morning sun was usually my friend, but today, as I stood before the vanity mirror in our dressing room, it felt like a betrayer. The bright, unforgiving light illuminated the disaster on my neck with crystal clarity. It sat right at the junction where my neck met my shoulder, a mark so dark and vivid it looked almost painted on. It was a bruise, a very large, very purple, very undeniable bruise. I traced the mark with my fingertips, wincing slightly, not from pain, but from the memory of exactly how it had gotten there. Bastian had been enthusiastic last night. After the incident at the training grounds, his protective instincts had been dialed up to a fever pitch. He hadn't been rough in anger, but in passion, his control sometimes slipped. He had wanted to mark me, to leave a physical claim that proved to his wolf that I was alive, safe, and entirely his. "Oh, this is bad," I whispered to my reflection. "The pack is going to have a field day." If I walked out there with a purple welt on my neck, the whispers would start immediately. The king lost his temper. The king struck her. I could already hear the pitying sighs of the elders. I grabbed a thick woven scarf from the drawer, a ridiculous choice for indoors but necessary, and wrapped it tightly around my throat, tucking the ends in to ensure maximum coverage. Bastian was already waiting for me in the private dining alcove, reading a report while nursing a mug of coffee. He looked up as I entered, his eyes immediately zeroing in on the scarf. A slow, lazy smirk spread across his face, and he lowered the paper. "Cold, little moon?" he asked, his voice thick with amusement. "Freezing," I lied, sitting opposite him and pouring myself tea. "Drafty castle. You should speak to the architects." Breakfast proceeded normally until Jace, Bastian's beater, entered with the morning briefings. Jace was a good man, loyal to a fault, but he was also deeply prone to worrying. He stood by the table, reading off patrol schedules, but his eyes kept darting to me, specifically to my neck. I realized with a jolt of horror that the scarf had loosened while I was buttering my toast. The heavy wool had slipped just an inch, likely revealing the edge of the mark. I quickly adjusted it, pulling it tighter, but the damage was done. Jace stopped reading. He paled. "My queen," Jace said, his voice trembling slightly. Are you injured?" The room went deadly silent. Bastian stopped chewing. He set his fork down with a deliberate clink. "Injured?" I squeaked, my hand flying to my throat. "No, Jace, I'm fine. Just a stiff neck." "I saw a mark," Jace pressed, bravely looking at Bastian with a mix of accusation and fear. "A dark mark. Sire, if the training yesterday upset you, surely—" "Jace?" Bastian warned, his voice a low rumble. "I just mean," Jace stammered, sweating now, "that the Luna is delicate." Bastian looked at Jace, then he looked at me. He didn't look angry. He looked insulted that anyone would think he would strike me in anger. But mostly, he looked incredibly, arrogantly smug. He stood up slowly, rounding the table like a panther stalking prey. He came to stand behind my chair, his large hands resting on my shoulders. "You think I hurt her, Jace?" Bastian asked softly. I saw a bruise, Alpha," Jace whispered, bracing himself for an explosion. "Show him, Nora," Bastian commanded gently, his fingers brushing against the wool of the scarf. My face burned. "Bastian, no!" "Show him," he repeated, "or I will." Defeated, and wanting to avoid Jace thinking I was being abused, I slowly unwound the scarf. The mark was on full display, a distinct, oval-shaped love bite that was unmistakably the result of a mouth, not a fist. Jace's eyes went wide, and his face turned the colour of a ripe tomato. He looked at the floor, the ceiling, anywhere but at me. I see. My apologies. I will go check the perimeter. Jace fled the room. I buried my face in my hands, groaning. I cannot believe you just did that. I am never leaving this room again. Bastian chuckled, a dark, vibrating sound against my back. He bent down, pressing a lingering kiss right on top of the mark, sending a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Don't hide it, he whispered against my skin, his lips moving against the sensitive bruise. I worked very hard on that masterpiece. In fact, I think it looks lonely. Tonight, I intend to put a matching one on the other side, just so things look symmetrical. Chapter 9. The Library Trap. The Royal Library was usually Bastian's sanctuary, a place of silence and strategy. It was a massive room, smelling of leather bindings, ink and wood polish. Walls of books stretched up to the high ceiling, accessible only by sliding ladders that I was forbidden to climb because Bastian was convinced I would fall and break my neck. Tonight, however, the library felt less like a sanctuary and more like a fortress of boredom. Bastian had been sequestered in there for 3 hours, dealing with trade disputes from the southern territories. I had tried to read in our room, I had tried to embroider, I had even tried to nap. But the bed felt too big and too cold without him. So I decided to become a distraction. I pushed open the heavy oak door. Bastian was seated behind his massive mahogany desk, surrounded by towers of parchment. He was frowning at a scroll, his brow furrowed in concentration, a quill gripped tightly in his hand. He looked tired. The tension in his shoulders was visible even from across the room. Go away, Jace, he grumbled without looking up. Tell the southern delegation they can wait until dawn. Not Jace, I said softly, closing the door behind me with a soft click. Bastian's head snapped up. The annoyance vanished instantly, replaced by a weary softness. Nora, it's late, you should be sleeping. I couldn't sleep, I admitted, walking around the edge of the desk. My pillow was missing. Your pillow is on the bed, he said confusedly. No, I said, stopping right next to his chair. My pillow is currently wearing a velvet waistcoat and frowning at a trade agreement. Bastian let out a short, surprised laugh. He pushed his chair back slightly, opening his arms. Come here, then. I didn't need to be told twice. I climbed into his lap, settling myself sideways so my legs draped over the armrest and my head rested against his shoulder. He adjusted automatically, one arm coming around to secure me against his chest, his chin resting on top of my head. He smelled of ink and fatigue, a scent I was beginning to associate with comfort. I still have work to do, he murmured, picking up his quill again with his free hand. This dispute regarding the grain tax is a headache. I won't disturb you, I promised, snuggling closer, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Just pretend I'm not here. I'm just a very heavy, very warm cat. He snorted. A cat, right. He tried to work. I gave him credit for the attempt. He dipped the quill and began to write, his hand moving rhythmically. But I could feel the shift in him. His heart rate had picked up, thumping a little harder against my ear. His body temperature seemed to rise. Every time he took a breath, he inhaled the scent of my shampoo, and I felt his grip on my waist tighten just a fraction. I reached out idly, tracing the buttons on his waistcoat with my finger, playing with the fabric. Bastian's writing became jagged. He paused. I moved my hand higher, brushing against the column of his throat. His pulse jumped under my fingertips. "Nora," he warned, his voice strained. "I'm just a cat," I whispered innocently, pressing a soft kiss to the side of his neck, right above his collar. The quill snapped. Ink splattered across the trade agreement, ruining 3 hours of work in a single second. Bastian didn't even look at the parchment. He dropped the broken quill and turned his full attention to me, his eyes dark and heavy. "You are a terrible liar," he growled, sweeping the rest of the papers off the desk with one swipe of his arm to make sure nothing else distracted him. The scrolls hit the floor with a chaotic rustle. "Your work," I gasped, looking at the mess. "Bastian, the grain tax." "The grain tax can rot," he said, shifting me so I was straddling his lap, facing him directly. "I have a new priority." He reached out and flicked his wrist toward the door. I heard the distinct, heavy thunk of the deadbolt sliding home, locking us in. "You locked the door," I breathed, my hands resting on his shoulders. "I did," he agreed, his hands sliding up my back to pull me flush against him. "And I am officially declaring a state of emergency. The king is in a very important meeting regarding the welfare of the Luna, and he is not to be disturbed until he says so." Chapter 10. The Nightmare. The scream didn't come from me. It came from the man sleeping beside me. I woke with a jolt, heart pounding, disoriented in the darkness. Beside me, Bastian was thrashing. The bed, usually a place of stillness, felt like a battleground. He was fighting an invisible enemy, his limbs jerking violently, a low, guttural snarl ripping from his throat that sounded nothing like my husband, and everything like a wounded animal. "No!" he roared, the sound shattering the silence of the room. "Don't touch her! I'll kill you!" "Bastian!" I scrambled up, reaching for him. His skin was slick with cold sweat, his muscles rock hard and trembling. "Bastian, wake up! You're dreaming!" He didn't hear me. He lashed out, his arms striking the heavy wooden headboard with a force that cracked the timber. He was lost in the nightmare, trapped in some terrifying scenario where he wasn't strong enough, wasn't fast enough. "Bastian, it's me! It's Nora!" I grabbed his face between my hands, forcing him to look at me, though his eyes were squeezed shut. "Open your eyes! I'm right here!" His eyes flew open. For a second, they were wild, glowing with a feral silver panic that I had never seen before. He looked at me, but he didn't see me. He saw a ghost. He saw a corpse. He gasped, sucking in air like a drowning man breaking the surface. "Nora?" His voice cracked. It was a broken, fragile sound that broke my heart instantly. "I'm here," I soothed, pulling his head down to my chest, wrapping my arms around his massive, shaking shoulders. "I'm right here. You're safe. We're safe." The fight went out of him all at once. He collapsed against me, burying his face in the curve of my neck, his entire body shuddering with the aftershocks of the terror. The Alpha King, the nightmare of the North, the man who could snap a sword in half with his bare hands, was sobbing. It wasn't a loud cry, just a silent, heaving release of tension that soaked my nightgown with his tears. I held him. I rocked him. I hummed a soft, wordless tune, stroking his damp hair, waiting for the storm to pass. "I lost you," he whispered into my skin, his voice muffled and thick. "In the dream. The rogues. They took you." And I couldn't move. I was chained. I had to watch. It wasn't real, I whispered back, kissing the top of his head. I'm right here. Feel my heart? It's beating. I'm not going anywhere. He pulled back just enough to look at me. In the moonlight, he looked younger, stripped of his crown and his armor. He looked terrified. He reached out, his trembling fingers tracing the line of my jaw, my lips, my eyebrows, as if he needed to memorize the tactile sensation of my existence. I am a fraud, he admitted, the confession hanging heavy in the air. The pack thinks I am this unshakable force. They think I fear nothing. You are unshakable, I insisted. No, he shook his head, his eyes burning with intensity. I am terrified, Nora, every single second of every single day. I am terrified that the universe will realize it made a mistake giving an angel to a monster, and it will take you back. He gripped my hand, pressing it flat against the center of his chest, right over his thundering heart. You think I hold the power in this kingdom? He asked, a sad, weary smile touching his lips. You are wrong. I am nothing without you. If you left me, if you died, I would cease to exist. You hold the leash, little moon. You are the only thing keeping the beast from consuming the man. Chapter 11. The Bad Hair Day. Sunlight streamed into the room, marking the end of the long, emotional night. But the heaviness of the nightmare seemed to have shifted something in Bastian. He wasn't brooding or distant. Instead, he had entered a state of hyper-focused domesticity. He hadn't left the bed when the sun rose, and he certainly hadn't gone to his morning briefings. Instead, he had decided that his primary duty for the day was personal grooming. Specifically, mine. I sat on the edge of the mattress, a silk robe wrapped loosely around me, while the king of the Silver Mist Pack sat behind me, his legs bracketed around my hips. In his massive, calloused hand, he held my delicate silver hairbrush. It looked comically small in his grip, like a toy designed for a child. He stared at the bristles with the same intensity he usually reserved for battle maps, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. Hold still, he murmured, his voice rumbling against my back. If you move, I might pull. You've been brushing the same section for 5 minutes, Bastian, I teased gently, leaning back into his warmth. I think it's detangled. Not to my satisfaction, he grumbled, his fingers carefully separating a lock of hair. There is a knot here, a very stubborn one. It offends me. I bit my lip to suppress a giggle. This was his way of decompressing. After the vulnerability of the nightmare, he needed a task, something tactile and simple where he could be gentle, where he could prove to himself that his hands were capable of nurturing rather than just destroying. He worked the brush through my hair with agonizing slowness, his breath hitching every time the bristles snagged even slightly. He treated my scalp as if it were made of spun glass, terrified that even a little pressure would shatter me. You know, I said softly, closing my eyes as the rhythmic brushing lulled me into a trance. You don't have to do this. I have handmaidens. The brushing stopped instantly. I felt his chest expand against my back as he took a deep, possessive breath. No, he stated flatly. No one else touches you. Not today. Today, I am the handmaiden. He resumed his work, moving from brushing to his true ambition, styling. Bastian had absolutely no training in hairdressing. His skills were limited to braiding ropes for climbing or securing tents. Yet he was determined to braid my hair. He divided the strands into 3 uneven sections, his tongue poking slightly from the corner of his mouth in sheer concentration. He wove the strands together with a grim determination, pulling them tight enough to withstand a hurricane. "Bastian," I squeaked, as he tugged a little too zealously. "That's tight." "Structural integrity is important," he muttered, loosening his grip immediately and pressing a contrite kiss to the top of my head. "Sorry, I am adjusting the tension." It took him 20 minutes. 20 minutes of grunting, sighing, and growling at slippery strands of hair that refused to obey his command. When he finally tied off the end with a ribbon, he sat back, exhaling as if he had just defeated an army single-handedly. "Done," he announced proudly. "Have a look." I stood up and walked to the vanity mirror. I had to summon every ounce of my acting ability to keep my expression neutral. The braid was unique. It was lopsided, veering sharply to the left. One chunk of hair had been missed entirely and hung loose near my ear. It looked less like a royal hairstyle and more like I had been dragged backward through a hedge by a confused bear. "It's," I started, catching his reflection in the mirror. He was watching me with anxious, hopeful eyes, his chest puffed out slightly. He looked so incredibly proud of his handiwork. "It's perfect," I finished, smiling brightly. "It feels very secure." Bastian grinned, a genuine, boyish expression that lit up his dark features. He walked up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist and resting his chin on my shoulder, looking at our reflection. Him, the rugged king, and me with my disastrously crooked braid. "You look like a queen," he whispered, kissing the loose strand of hair he had missed. "My queen. And now, I think we should go to the village. I want everyone to see my work." My heart stopped. He wanted me to go out in public like this? But looking at his beaming face, I knew I couldn't say no. I would wear this lopsided braid to the ends of the earth if it made him look at me like that. "Lead the way, husband," I said, turning in his arms. "But if anyone laughs, you have to promise not to growl at them." "I make no such promises," he replied, lifting me effortlessly into his arms rather than letting me walk. "If they laugh, it just means they have no appreciation for art." Chapter 12. The Midnight Craving. The castle clock had struck 2 in the morning hours ago. The world was silent, wrapped in the heavy velvet darkness of the night. Beside me, Bastian was asleep, his breathing a steady, comforting rhythm. But I was wide awake. My stomach gave a loud, treacherous growl that sounded like a small predator was trapped beneath the duvet. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to will the hunger away. It wasn't just hunger, it was a specific, clawing need. I needed chocolate. I needed cake. I needed something sweet immediately, or I was going to perish. I tried to slip out of bed carefully, but the moment I shifted my weight, a steel arm clamped around my waist. Bastian didn't even open his eyes. "Threat?" he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep, his muscles tensing instantly as he pulled me back against him. "No threat," I whispered, patting his arm. "Just starvation. Go back to sleep. I'm going to the kitchen." His eyes snapped open. In the moonlight, the silver irises glowed with sudden alertness. "Kitchen? It's the middle of the night. The castle is dark." "I know the way, Bastian. I just need a snack." "Absolutely not," he grumbled, sitting up and rubbing a hand over his face. "The stone floors are cold, and there are shadows. I will go." "Bastian, you are the king. You can't go raiding the pantry in your pajamas." He ignored me, throwing the covers back and swinging his legs out of bed. He was wearing nothing but loose sleeping trousers. I am the king. I can do whatever I want. And right now, what I want is for you to stay warm while I hunt for... He paused, looking back at me. What is the objective? Chocolate, I said seriously. Anything with chocolate. And maybe strawberries. And cake, if there is any left from dinner. Chocolate, strawberries, cake. Target acquired. He marched out of the room with the seriousness of a man going to war. I sat back against the pillows, smiling into the darkness. I waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. I began to wonder if he had gotten lost or distracted by a guard. Then the door creaked open. Bastian entered, but he wasn't carrying a plate. He was pushing a service cart, and the cart was overflowing. He had clearly raided the entire bakery section of the kitchens. There was a whole chocolate ganache cake, a bowl of strawberries, a jar of honey, several croissants, and what looked like a block of cheese he had grabbed just in case. I didn't know which one you wanted specifically, he said, breathless, pushing the cart to the side of the bed. So I acquired everything. Bastian! I laughed, staring at the feast. This is enough to feed the council. The cook woke up, he admitted, looking slightly sheepish as he climbed back onto the bed, bringing a plate of cake with him. He screamed when he saw me. Apparently, seeing the Alpha King shirtless in the pantry holding a jar of honey is frightening. I burst out laughing, imagining the poor chef's face. Bastian grinned, breaking off a piece of the dark, rich cake with his fingers. He held it out to me, his eyes softening. Here, he murmured, sustenance for the Luna. I took the bite, moaning at the taste of the rich chocolate. Bastian watched me chew, his gaze dropping to my lips. He picked up a strawberry, dipped it into the jar of honey, and held it out next. We sat there in the middle of the night, surrounded by crumbs and sugar, eating like gluttonous children. It was messy. It was ridiculous. It was the most romantic dinner I had ever had. Bastian didn't care about the mess on the sheets or the fact that he had terrified his staff. He only cared that I was eating. You have chocolate, he whispered, leaning in close, his thumb brushing the corner of my mouth. Right there. Did you get it? I asked. Not yet, he rumbled, his voice dropping an octave, shifting from playful to predatory in a heartbeat. I think I need to use a different method. He leaned forward, pressing his lips to the corner of my mouth, licking the smudge of sweetness away. His kiss was slow, tasting of cocoa and honey, dragging a sigh from my throat. He pulled back just an inch, his forehead resting against mine. You taste better than the cake, he whispered, his hand sliding into my hair. Much sweeter. I think I'm still hungry, Nora, but not for food. Chapter 13. The Winter Solstice Prep. The morning of the Winter Solstice Ball arrived with the subtlety of a landslide. The castle was vibrating with energy. Servants rushed through the corridors carrying garlands of winter ivy and silver ribbons. The smell of roasting meats and spiced wine permeated every stone of the citadel. It was the most important night of the year for the Silver Mist Pack, a night of politics, dancing, and tradition. For Bastian, it was apparently a night of sheer torture. He had been pacing our room for an hour, growling low in his throat every time someone knocked on the door. The local tailors had sent up 5 different options for my gown, all beautiful, all expensive, and all currently rejected by the Alpha King, who was glaring at the fabric swatches as if they had personally insulted his lineage. This blue is too pale, he snapped, tossing the silk onto the growing pile of rejected garments on the floor. "It washes her out. And this red? It's too aggressive. She isn't a war banner." "Bastian," I sighed, sitting on the vanity stool in my slip. "We have to pick something. The ball starts in 2 hours." "None of them are good enough," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "They don't capture you." He turned to the final garment bag, hanging alone on the wardrobe door. He unzipped it slowly. It was a gown of pure liquid silver. The fabric shimmered like moonlight on water, delicate and ethereal. It was simple, elegant, and breathtaking. Bastian went still. He reached out, touching the silk with a reverence he usually saved for ancient relics. "This one," he whispered. "Wear this one." I stood up and walked over to him. "It's beautiful." "Put it on," he commanded softly, taking the dress off the hanger. "I want to do it." I stepped into the gown, the cool silk sliding over my skin like water. It fit perfectly, hugging my curves before cascading down to the floor in a pool of silver. I turned my back to him so he could fasten it. Usually, Bastian's hands were quick and efficient. Today, they trembled. I felt his warm knuckles graze my spine as he slowly pulled the zipper up. He took his time, pressing a kiss to each vertebrae as he covered it with silk. It was an intimate, agonizingly slow process. When the zipper reached the top, his hands settled on my shoulders, heavy and warm. "Look," he whispered, turning me toward the full-length mirror. I looked. The woman in the reflection looked regal, glowing in the silver gown. But what caught my eye wasn't the dress. It was the man standing behind her. Bastian was wearing his formal blacks, a stark contrast to my silver. He looked dark, dangerous, and utterly captivating. His eyes were locked on my reflection, filled with a mixture of worship and possessiveness that made my knees weak. "You look—" He trailed off, shaking his head as if words had failed him. He buried his face in the crook of my neck, inhaling deeply. "I don't want to go down there." "Bastian, you're the king. You have to open the ball." "I don't want to share you," he admitted, his voice muffled against my skin. "I don't want them looking at you. I don't want them breathing the same air as you. I want to lock this door and keep you here, in the silver dress, just for me." "They can look," I said, turning in his arms to cup his face, forcing him to look at me. "But they know who I belong to, and I know who belongs to me." He leaned into my touch, closing his eyes. "You have no idea how hard it is," he rasped, "to walk into a room full of wolves and pretend that I care about anything other than the woman standing next to me." "Then don't pretend," I whispered. "Just look at me." He opened his eyes, the silver irises burning. "Oh, I will look at you, little moon. I intend to spend the entire night doing nothing else. And if anyone dares to interrupt my view, well, let's just hope the musicians play loud enough to cover the growling." He offered me his arm, the gesture formal, but the grip tight and desperate. "Ready?" "Ready," I lied. My heart was pounding, not because of the crowd waiting downstairs, but because of the way the king was looking at me, like I was the only star in his sky. Chapter 14. The Entrance. The double doors at the top of the grand staircase were made of heavy polished oak, intricately carved with the history of the pack. Usually, I admired the craftsmanship, but tonight, They looked less like doors and more like the gates to a coliseum. Beyond them lay the great hall, filled to capacity with every high-ranking wolf in the Silver Mist territory, all waiting to see their king and his fragile mate. Bastian stood beside me, his presence a solid, grounding force against my rising nerves. He looked devastating in his formal blacks, the dark fabric tailored perfectly to emphasize the terrifying width of his shoulders. He adjusted his cuffs, his expression grim, as if he were preparing to invade a neighboring kingdom rather than dance a waltz. "Remember," he murmured, leaning down so his lips brushed my ear, sending a jolt of heat through me that momentarily distracted me from the crowd. "If anyone gets too close, step behind me. If anyone asks you a question you don't want to answer, look at me, and I will make them regret learning to speak." "Bastian, please try not to threaten the guests before we even serve the appetizers," I whispered back, squeezing his arm. "Just smile. Or at least, don't scowl." He looked at me, his silver eyes softening instantly as they swept over my face. "I cannot smile at them, Nora. They are breathing your air. But I will attempt to refrain from growling, for your sake." The herald struck his staff against the floor, and the heavy doors groaned open. The sound of the party, the chatter, the clinking of glasses, the string quartet, died instantly. It was as if someone had sucked the air out of the room. Silence crashed over the great hall. Hundreds of eyes turned upward, fixing on us. I felt the weight of their scrutiny physically, 1,000 questions and judgments directed at the weak Luna, standing beside the tyrant king. I instinctively tightened my grip on Bastian's arm. He felt it. Immediately, his body shifted. He didn't move in front of me, but he angled his frame so that he was a looming, protective shadow. He scanned the crowd below, his gaze cold and assessing, daring anyone to show even a flicker of disrespect. We began the descent. Every step echoed in the silence. My silver dress flowed around me like water, the silk whispering against the stone stairs. Bastian matched his pace to mine, moving with a predatory grace that made the warriors at the bottom of the stairs straighten their spines. He wasn't dragging me. He was escorting me, treating me like a piece of fragile glass that he was terrified of dropping. As we reached the landing, the crowd parted like the Red Sea. No one dared to approach. I saw the beater's wife whispering behind her fan, her eyes wide with what looked like pity. She likely thought Bastian's tight grip on my hand was a restraint. She couldn't know that his thumb was stroking the back of my knuckles in a soothing, rhythmic caress, or that he was whispering a running commentary under his breath. "That dress on the Duchess is hideous," he murmured, his face impassive as he nodded regally to a bowing elder. "It looks like she's skinned a sofa, and the music is too slow. Do you want me to fire the orchestra?" "The music is fine," I whispered through a fixed smile, nodding to the crowd. "It's not fine," he countered, his voice a low rumble that only I could hear. "It's boring. You deserve better than boring waltzes. You deserve a symphony written by the stars." We reached the throne dais at the front of the room. Bastian led me to my seat, waiting until I was settled before taking his own. He didn't sit back and relax. He sat on the edge of his throne, his body angled toward me, his eyes never leaving my profile. He ignored the diplomats, the generals, and the eager debutantes hoping for a glance. He just watched me, as if he were memorizing the way the candlelight caught the silver in my dress. The music swelled, signaling the start of the first dance.
Traditionally, the Alpha King would pull his Luna onto the floor and display his dominance. The pack waited, holding their breath. Bastian stood up. The room flinched. He held out his hand to me, palm up, his expression open and inviting. "My queen," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, deep and resonant.
"Would you do me the extraordinary honor of allowing me to hold you?" I placed my hand in his, and he didn't yank me up. He bowed low, pressing a kiss to my wrist, his eyes burning with a devotion so intense it felt like a physical touch. As he led me to the floor, the music stopped abruptly. Bastian raised a hand, silencing the conductor with a single look. "Not that song," he commanded, his voice dark. "Play the one she likes, the one in minor key."
Chapter 15. The Kneeling King. The waltz had been a dream. For 3 minutes the rest of the world had dissolved, leaving only the heat of Bastian's hand on my waist and the fluid sync of our bodies moving together. But now the dance was over, and the reality of the social event was crashing back in. We were standing near the refreshment table, surrounded by a tight circle of high-ranking pack members. The air was thick with tension. The elders were trying to engage Bastian in conversation about territory expansion. But Bastian was barely listening. He was busy using his body to shield me from a draft coming from the balcony door, shifting slightly every time the wind blew to ensure I remained warm.
"The southern border requires reinforcement, sire," General Cale was saying, his voice stiff. "We need your authorization to move the battalions." "Send the paperwork to my study," Bastian dismissed, his eyes focused on the glass of wine in my hand. "Nora, you haven't drunk anything. Is it not to your liking? I can have them open a different vintage. I can have them open the cellar."
"It's fine, Bastian. I'm just listening," I said, taking a sip to appease him. The general looked annoyed at being ignored for a beverage preference.
"Sire, with all due respect, the battalions can wait 5 minutes, General," Bastian snapped, his voice dropping to that dangerous, gravelly register that made seasoned warriors sweat. "My mate is thirsty." The circle went silent. I felt a flush of embarrassment creep up my neck. I shifted my weight, trying to diffuse the tension, intending to set the wineglass down on the high table behind me. I misjudged the distance. The heavy crystal goblet clipped the edge of the marble table. It tipped. I tried to catch it, but my fingers slipped on the condensation. Crash! The sound was deafening in the sudden quiet of the hall. The goblet shattered against the stone floor, exploding into 1,000 glittering shards. Dark red wine sprayed everywhere, across the pristine white tablecloth, across the general's boots, and all over the hem of my silver dress. The entire ballroom gasped. The music faltered and died. Every head turned toward us. In the Silver Mist Pack, wasting wine at the solstice was considered a bad omen, a sign of clumsiness and disrespect. But more importantly, making a mess in front of the Alpha King was a death sentence. The pack waited for the explosion. They waited for Bastian to roar, to humiliate me, to drag me out of the hall for embarrassing him. I froze, horrified, staring at the red stains spreading on my gown. "I am so sorry," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I slipped." Bastian moved. He didn't shout. He didn't scowl. He didn't even look at the general or the wine. He dropped to his knees. The collective intake of breath from the room sucked the oxygen right out of the air. The Alpha King, the Nightbringer, the man who had never bowed to anyone in his life, fell to the hard stone floor at my feet without a second of hesitation. He ignored the wine soaking into the knees of his expensive trousers. He ignored the shards of glass glittering dangerously close to his hands. "Don't move," he commanded, but his voice wasn't angry. It was frantic. "Don't take a step." His large, calloused hands hovered over my ankles, terrified to touch, scanning my skin with the intensity of a surgeon. He gently lifted the hem of my dress, not caring about the wine staining his fingers. "Did it cut you?" he demanded, looking up at me, his eyes wide and silver with panic. "Nora, answer me. Are you bleeding?" "Bastian," I stammered, aware of 500 people staring at us in absolute shock. "I'm fine. It's just wine. Your pants—" "To hell with the pants!" he roared, his voice cracking with desperation. He gently ran his thumb over my instep, checking for even the tiniest scratch. "There is glass everywhere. If you were hurt, if one piece of glass touched you—" He bowed his head, pressing his forehead against my shin, his shoulders shaking slightly with the adrenaline of his fear. "I should have caught it," he muttered into the silk of my dress, loud enough for the nearby circle to hear. "I was too slow. I should have caught it before it fell. I failed you." I looked around the room. The general's jaw was on the floor. The beta's wife looked like she was about to faint. The pity in their eyes was gone, replaced by a stunned, reeling realization. They weren't looking at a tyrant and his victim. They were looking at a man who would burn the world down if his wife got a paper cut. Bastian lifted his head, oblivious to them all. He leaned forward and pressed a soft, reverent kiss to my ankle, right above the strap of my heel. "Tell me you're not hurt," he begged softly. "Please, little moon." Chapter 16. The Shattered Illusion. The image of the Alpha King kneeling in spilled wine, kissing his mate's foot, seemed to freeze time itself. The silence in the great hall was heavy, pregnant with the shattering of 1,000 misconceptions. The monster was gone. In his place was a man so hopelessly, desperately in love, that he had forgotten he was a king the moment I dropped a glass. "I'm not hurt, Bastian," I said softly, reaching down to touch his hair. "I promise, not a scratch." He let out a shuddering breath, turning his face to kiss my palm, his eyes finally losing that frantic silver edge. He slowly stood up, unfolding his massive frame, tower over the room once more. But the dynamic had changed. He wasn't scary anymore. Well, he was, but in a completely different way. He looked down at the puddle of wine and glass. Then he looked at my stained dress. A frown etched deep lines into his forehead. "Your dress is ruined," he stated, his voice full of genuine regret. "You looked like starlight, and now you are wet. You must be cold." Without waiting for a response, he shrugged off his heavy, ceremonial black jacket. He draped it over my shoulders, engulfing me in his warmth and his scent. Then, before I could react, he swept me up into his arms, lifting me high against his chest in a bridal carry. "Bastian!" I gasped, clutching his shirt. "I can walk!" "There is glass on the floor," he said simply, as if that explained everything. "I am not risking your feet." He turned to face the room. The crowd was still gaping. The general was still staring at the wet spots on the king's knees. Bastian seemed to realize for the first time that we had an audience. He adjusted his grip on me, pulling me tighter, and leveled a glare at the room that dared anyone to speak. "The music!" he barked, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "Why is it stopped? Did I command silence? No, I commanded a celebration." The conductor, terrified, immediately began conducting the orchestra.
A frantic, slightly too fast waltz filled the air. "My queen is retiring for the evening," Bastian announced to the stunned assembly. "She has had a shock. Anyone who disturbs us will answer to me." He began to walk toward the exit, carrying me through the crowd as if I weighed nothing. As we passed the Beta's wife, who was still fanning herself rapidly, Bastian paused. He looked down at her, a wicked, arrogant smirk playing on his lips. "You were staring, madam," he rumbled. I, the woman stammered. "You were wondering if she is weak," Bastian said, his voice carrying just enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "She isn't.
She is the only thing holding me together. So I suggest you show some respect to the woman who keeps your king from tearing this castle down out of boredom." He didn't wait for a response. He strode out of the great hall, kicking the heavy doors open with his boot. As we crossed the threshold into the quiet of the corridor, leaving the noise of the party behind, I rested my head against his shoulder, listening to the steady, powerful thrum of his heart. "You realize," I whispered, smiling into his neck, "that you just ruined your reputation. They won't fear the nightmare of the North anymore. They'll just call you the simp of the South." Bastian chuckled, a deep, vibrating sound that went straight to my bones. He shifted me in his arms, pressing a kiss to my forehead as he carried me up the grand staircase. "Let them talk," he murmured. "I don't care if they fear me. I don't care if they respect me. As long as they know that you are the center of my universe, they can call me whatever they want. Besides..." He paused on the landing, looking down at me with eyes that shone like molten silver. "The party was boring anyway. I have a much better idea of how to spend the rest of the solstice." Chapter 17. Forever the Alpha's Prize. The heavy door of our chambers clicked shut, locking the world away. The silence of the room was a balm after the chaos of the ballroom. Bastian didn't put me down immediately. He carried me all the way to the bed, setting me down on the edge of the mattress with a tenderness that made my heart ache. He stepped back, running a hand through his hair, looking at me. The adrenaline of the evening was fading, leaving him looking exhausted but profoundly content. He began to undo his cufflinks, tossing them onto the nightstand. "I suppose I owe the cleaning staff an apology," he mused, unbuttoning his shirt. "That was a lot of wine." "You owe the general an apology," I laughed, shrugging off his heavy jacket. "You completely ignored him to stare at my ankles." "The general is a bore," Bastian said, tossing his shirt aside and joining me on the bed. He reached out, his fingers tracing the stained silk of my dress. "But this is a tragedy. I loved this dress." "It's just fabric, Bastian." "It's the fabric that was touching you," he countered, leaning in to press a kiss to my shoulder. "Take it off. I want to see if the wine's soaked through. I need to ensure you aren't sticky." I allowed him to help me out of the ruined gown. He was efficient but slow, his hands lingering on my skin, his touch warm and claiming. When I was finally stripped down to my slip, he pulled me into his lap, wrapping his arms around me and burying his face in my hair. "Did I embarrass you?" he asked quietly, the vulnerability returning to his voice. "Down there, kneeling like a fool?" "Bastian," I pulled back, framing his face with my hands. "You showed them the truth. You showed them that you love me. How could that embarrass me?" He leaned into my touch, closing his eyes. "I don't just love you, Nora. Love is too small a word. It's too tame." He opened his eyes, and the intensity in them took my breath away. "You are my breath. You are the gravity that keeps me tethered to this earth. When that glass broke, For a second, I thought the world was ending because something sharp was near you. I kissed him then, a slow, deep kiss that tasted of relief and promise. I'm not glass, Bastian. I won't break. I'm right here. I know, he murmured against my lips. But I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to be strong. I will be strong enough for both of us. You just have to be mine. Always, I whispered. He pulled me down into the pillows, the sheets cool against my skin, his body a heavy, comforting weight over mine. The castle outside could whisper all it wanted. The pack could gossip about the king who knelt for his queen. Let them. In this room, in the sanctuary of his arms, there were no titles, no politics, no expectations. There was just Bastian, the man who would burn the world for me, and me, the woman who held his heart in the palm of her hand. Happy solstice, little moon, he whispered, his eyes closing as he settled against me, finally at peace. Happy solstice, my king, I replied, running my fingers through his hair. Let them fear the Alpha. Let them tremble at his roar. I knew the truth. I looked down at the sleeping face of the most powerful wolf in the kingdom, currently drooling slightly on my shoulder, and smiled. I was the only one who knew the secret. I was the only one who knew how to make the monster purr. And just like that, we leave Bastian and Nora wrapped in each other's arms, safe from the world outside. I hope you enjoyed seeing the softer side of the Alpha King as much as I enjoyed bringing him to life for you. If this story warmed your heart, please give this video a big thumbs up. It really helps the channel finding more listeners who love romance just as much as we do. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story from the library. I want to hear from you in the comments. Tell me, which part had you swooning the most? Was it the scene in the library, the garden chase, or that moment he knelt in the Great Hall? Also, don't forget to let me know where you're tuning in from today. I love seeing how far our pack reaches around the globe. Thank you so much for spending your time with me. Until the next full moon, keep the romance alive.